coming. I really appreciate that. The class we're going to be doing is fighting in the French style. The dates have shifted a couple of times over the course of this project, and so some of the advertisements went out saying it was 14th, 15th, and 16th. In reality, it's going to be more 15th, 16th, and 17th. We're going to talk a little bit about the 14th century because there's a pretty important book that we don't have that we're going to talk about for a little bit. But what my intent with this class is to give people an overview, if you are looking at what French fencing is, to give you an overview of what was available to somebody in France during this time period. We're also going to question whether there is an actual French system. And we'll talk about that a little towards the end after we've gone through all of the information. We're going to talk a little bit about the guilds, about what they were teaching, who was teaching, and then we're going to talk about what written material was available. I want to issue a couple of my standard disclaimers. The first one is, this is all my interpretation. We've got the class notes that I will offer to email out to people after this is over has got the bibliography in it, so you can take a look at the sources and go back to it. In the bibliography, we also have access to a lot of the manuals online. There are free versions, and if you're not familiar with Wiktenauer, although I think from the people I'm seeing here, everybody is probably familiar with Wiktenauer. It's a great website, and a lot of these manuals are up for free in English translations. Several of the French versions of these manuals are also offered online at Wiktenauer, so something I'm going to be playing with down the line. I do not read French, so what I am relying on are English translations of all of these manuals. So interpretations and attitudes on these things may change as I learn more French, which is what I've been doing during the pandemic, and start looking at some of the original sources for myself. Also, my disclaimer that this is the first time I've taught this class. So if after we're done, if there's things that you didn't think worked well or that you liked or that you want more information on or suggestions, always feel free to contact me personally, Facebook or my email, and I would love to talk about it. And so let's go ahead and start. I'm going to share my screen here real quick. Okay. So what we're focusing on is the 15th, 16th, and 17th century. I do understand that the SCA ends at the 1600s. Most of our rapier stuff is started during that period, but is after that. I personally like the 1650 cutoff date, so that's what I did the research for. You're feel free to ignore everything that takes place after the 1600, and I'm pretty clear on dates for the different manuals as we go through in the handout. So what we're going to look at is who was teaching. There were guilds in France. We also have some royal edicts requiring certain type of training that we're going to look at to see what type of weapons they would have been using and who was teaching. And then we're going to talk primarily about the resources that were available to the French. Then we're going to be talking about three different, well, I'll get into that when we get to the section on books. So let's go ahead and start with the French guilds. So we have three guilds or companies that already existed in the French military prior to the beginning of the 16th century. So throughout most of the 15th century, there were three guilds. There was the Guild of St. Barbara, which was for the culvenaires, which were handguns at the time, but also later became known with the cannons. We also have the Guild of St. Michael for archers and the Guild of St. George for crossbowmen. And these were not nobles that were part of these guilds. These were commoners, and they were training together. They also were one of the basic building blocks for the army, and it's also being used by Paris and other large cities as their their watch or their guards for the city. Towards the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century, we see a fourth company coming up, and that is the Company of St. Michael, and that was referred to as the Escrimers. And these were these were the infantrymen who were using pole weapons and swords and shields. Then by 1513, we find our first reference. Well, 1513 is the first reference to the Company of Saint Michael. 1567 is our first formal charter for the French fencing masters in Paris. It was a royal charter, and it was specifically for Paris. It looks like each of the large cities had a fencing guild, but we don't have a lot of good documentation on those. Apparently, there is a really good book on this subject in French that I will be hoping to look at in the future. But what we've got are snippets of it from other sources that have been translated. And what I have good information on is the Paris guilds. So in 1567, they were requiring that foreign masters be teach for no more than 6 weeks without joining the guild. And they had the rules for creating provosts and moving masters up. And then in 1644, we have another charter, and this is the one that really starts defining the French system and codifying it. And we'll talk more about that with the masters. And at this point, they are banning foreign masters from participating in the guilds. You have to be a native born in French. You have to be French in order to participate as playing the prize for a master and becoming a provost and then a master. When you're in both of the documents, we have what weapons they tested with in order to advance. And those were sword and dagger, halberd, and well, sword and dagger and two-handed sword were the three that they had to teach. The first charter that we have in the 1567 was saying that they had to play with staff and halberd, but then the later one in 1644 said that staff and halberd wasn't required, even though they had to know it to teach it. So we've got 5 weapon systems that we know the French were teaching. There's a 6th one, and that's the pike. So Francis had this brilliant idea that he was going to recreate the Roman legions, and they were going to be in the form of pike. He even issued statements to nobility, issued requests for nobility that were willing to take command of a century of pike, would be relieved of the responsibility to provide horse and harness, so they could become a captain of pike in exchange for not having to provide the higher standards for armor and for the horse. They were required to meet on at regular times to. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So the legions were basically the conscripts. These were required to have, each village and town was required to have so many people towards the pike, and there was 5 different regions set up, so they had 5 legions. As far as we know, only 2 legions ever actually took the field in full. Pieces of the legion showed up throughout most of the 16th and early 17th century until we started getting into the standing army late in the 1600s. We knew they were required to meet regularly for practice. What we don't know is what regularly means, how often they were meeting, but we do know that they were getting together for practice and they were teaching some type of system for the use of pike to put it all together. The problem is, for all of these, we don't know what it was. The charters and the edicts do not state specifically what was being taught other than the weapon systems themselves. Okay, so I'm going to pause here before we get into the next section to see if there's any questions or commentary. And I'm perfectly okay with questions and people talking. That doesn't bother me at all. Feedback is good.
Okay, real quick, I'm just curious about the pike legions of Francis, whether he was also being influenced by the Spanish tercio.
I don't honestly know. They had relied very heavily on Swiss and Lansquenet mercenaries in the 15th century. And the article I was reading said that he was trying to break his dependence on the mercenaries and bring something that was easier to use and was having some good luck other places. But I don't know specifically if he was following the Spanish or not.
What year was he starting this again?
The Pike Legions was 1531.
That's about the same time, I think. I don't remember exactly when. I think Cordoba maybe a little earlier, but not too much.
And what was the name you were using for the pikemen?
Oh, Cordoba, the Grand Captain, was the Spaniard behind the tercios.
I'll look that up. The edict was pretty cool, and I thought it seemed like it would be a great idea. In reality, apparently, the fourth and the fifth legions were the only ones that ever actually made it to a battlefield intact. Most of the other ones were a couple hundred here and a couple hundred there. And then they disappeared late in the 16th century and were brought back in the 17th and early in the 17th as they were trying to cope with no longer really being the dominant force on the battlefield. We're going to talk about that a little bit with in the next section with the first book. Was there any other commentary about the French schools or the pikes? And the articles that I got on the French schools are actually pretty cool because it talks a lot about how the provosts will be trained and how the provosts would be tested to become a master, including as well as talking about prizes for the public version of the provost before they go to fence the 6 masters individually. So there's a lot of good talk about that, and that may be another class down the line. There's a lot more on the French masters that I'd like to find out, but the big book on it is still in French, not in English. So, okay, so if there's no other commentary, all right. So we're going to head into written material. So there's 3 different types of works that we're going to discuss here. The first one, and it comes up in the very first work we're going to discuss, are the books that no longer exist. We have records that they exist. Sometimes we even know what the subject matter was, but we no longer have a surviving copy of them. The second one is manuscripts, and a lot of what we have are manuscripts. Some of these manuscripts were widely distributed, and multiple copies have survived into our time. Some we just have one copy of, and we don't know how widely circulated they were. So there's going to be a lot of questions as to the influence that some of these manuscripts may have had. And then we have the printed work, and these were printed books. Some of these were obscure. Some of these were widely distributed, and I don't have a lot of good information on how widely any of these books were distributed. There was a discussion in one of the articles that I had specifically about the borders, and we'll talk about that when we get to him. So the first one that we're going to talk about is a book that we no longer have. It was a manuscript. It was a 3-volume set called Traité de l'Espée. It was translated The Treaty of the Sword. And this was, we don't know when it was written, but we know it was in the Library of the Kings of France during the late 1300s. So it was probably written earlier than that. It is in the library. There is a brief mention of it in the library rolls and what is in it on 2 different occasions. So in 1638, we know it was there. We know it disappeared after the library was disbanded in I'm sorry, in 13, I'm getting the dates wrong. Let me go back real quick. So in 1373, we know it was there. And in 1435, when the Royal Library was disbanded, it disappears and nobody knows what happened to it. Nobody knows where it went. So the book's gone, but it was specifically dealing with training and techniques in chivalric combat. So it was that we believe it was mounted. We believe it was as well as on foot. Exactly what it was teaching and what weapons, we don't know. But the article that I was reading where that was talking about this particular book also pointed out that this was during the height of the French dominance on the battlefield. The French were that in the 1300s and early 1400s, they were still relying heavily on cavalry and specifically the heavy cavalry, and were doing very well with it. And this book seems to be what they were teaching in regards to that. And unfortunately, it's gone. The next book that we do have is also very early. And again, this isn't really a manual on techniques. And this is Christine de Pizan's book on the deeds of arms. And she is talking specifically most of the time about dealing with warfare. Her book was viewed for a long time as just a retelling of Exodus. However, when you're reading through the work, she has a lot of commentary on what she is calling the modern practices. And there is some discussion in there of what weapons they are teaching the youth to get them ready for warfare and battle, and what weapons knights should be using. And one of the weapons that she talks about, besides the two-handed sword, is also the staff. And she is specifically talking at that time about them using it as a training device for knightly weapons, but she also said that it was a nice weapon of last resort for commoners. So I'm including her in because there is a little bit of discussion about how they were training and teaching in there. The other thing is she was writing in the early 1400s and had royal patronage. So she may have had access to our first work, the Treaty of the Sword. But whether she actually did or not, I can't prove. But I do have evidence that she had access to the Royal Library and that she had royal patronage during the time in which this book was in the library. So I kind of thought that was cool. So now we're going to actually jump right into some of the manuals on techniques. Does anybody have any commentary about the first two works that we've talked about, or questions? Okay. So Le Jeu de la Hack is our oldest surviving French work that we have. It is a single manuscript from somewhere early in the 15th century. So the translation that is available on Wiktenauer states repeatedly that there is no evidence within the text as to who wrote the manual, where they came from, or necessarily the time frame. There's some evidence with the manuscript itself, as far as the writing and the paper, that lends people to believe that it was early in the 1500s. I'm sorry, early in the 15th century. However, there's a new book out that I've picked up that I really like, called The Burgundian Poleaxe. It is available from Freelance Press, and they've got a little bit of a different view. Jason Smith, who wrote the book, is arguing that there was a Master Ambrose of Milan who was well known for the poleaxe and wrote this specifically for a guild in Burgundy. He has some good evidence to support his claim. There's enough proof that I didn't list him as necessarily the author of the work, but I do want to include it in for two reasons. One, He's got a really nice section where he talks about the culture and the history of the poleaxe. He also goes deep into the use of the poleaxe from Le Jeu de la Hawk, and it is a really well done book. The poleaxe was considered a knightly weapon, although we see it in woodcuts of battlefields all the way through the 16th century. And most of the people using it are in more armor than the other people that are in the woodcut, but not exclusively. Also, there could be an argument made in one of our later authors when we talk about Marotzo. Marotzo argues that what you can do with a poleaxe, you can do with a halberd. So this could be the basis for what the French were doing with a halberd. That is conjecture. What we do know is that it's in French, that it was a manuscript. We don't know if there were other copies of it. We don't know how widely it was being distributed, but we do know that the weapon was popular enough and being used enough in the region that these techniques may have been known. Am I annoying people by stopping after each of these masters and asking if there's questions? Then I will keep doing it. Does anybody have any comments about Le Jeu de la Hawk? Okay. So I get arguments about whether, and I can't pronounce the German name to save my life, so I'm going to butcher it, but Ponfont or Ponfont. I listed him in my class notes as our first foreign master. However, I have been told by a couple of people that Burgundy during different times was an independent state from France. So it could be that Jeu de la Hawk was our first foreign master. So it just depends on how you want to look at it. However, this is a German work that was printed in German, and I do not know the exact dialect on it. And it was printed in 1516. There is a French translation of it in 1538 that came out. The woodcut that you see here is from the original book. The French version didn't have as many woodcuts as the German translation did. So it is not what we think of as a translation. In our modern settings and with modern academics, we try to be very faithful to the original. And one of the things that I have found repeatedly when looking at works that were translated in period, when I can compare the two, they very often are not the same work. There is always some bias towards the culture that is translating it that creeps in. One of a really good example of that really doesn't apply to this class at all. I'm losing names. That's okay. Excuse me. Okay, so going back to the German, we've got a lot of, there are three different weapons that they are teaching in this particular book. We've got the two-handed sword. We have the staff, which is shown here. And it's the first time that the staff by itself shows up in any of the manuals in French. And he also has a section on Dussac and Messer, kind of combining the two. So although this particular work is not referenced by any of the other masters that we're dealing with, it is the German system being used in France, or being taught in France at least. I've been told that this book was in the library for Meyer, and it's one of the books that he references in his book. So the system does not stop here. Apparently it does go on, and definitely would have had an influence. And like I said, is one of our big resources to show that the German school was being was known and probably being used in France. Any comments about that before I go on? Okay. So now we're going to hit Marotzo. Achille Marotzo is an Italian. He is one of the primary masters in the Bolognese school. His work has been reprinted in Italian throughout the 16th and 17th century. It was also translated into French. We do not have a surviving copy of the French text, so I do not know how close it was to the original. We also do not have an exact date that the French version of Marotzo shows up in France, but we know it was prior to any of the French writers of the sword that we're going to be talking about later. So there's an argument that will be made repeatedly through this, through several of the sources that I use, that what we think of as French fencing has a strong Italian flair. And the reason for that very well could be that one of the earliest books on the sword that was in France was from an Italian and from a pretty established school. And we're going to see the Bolognese school show up again in a little bit. We do not get any specific commentary from any of the masters going on from here that Marotzo was an influence on them. But when we start looking if you start looking through the works of DDA, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit, you're going to see a lot of Bolognese type movements and Bolognese type philosophy in there. And I think this could be a good explanation why. It also has been, the Bolognese system is one of the ones that I've gone back to when working through DDA. When I get stuck with something, I kind of look to see if there's something comparable in the Bolognese, and that has worked pretty well for me because there does seem to be a strong connection between the two. Okay. So the next master we are going to jump to is DDA. So we were just talking about him. This is one of the first of the French masters and one of my favorite. He is the reason why I got involved in looking at French fencing to begin with. I've got a French persona, and the Laura Angati's translation of DDA came out, I guess, almost 15 years ago, maybe longer than that. And it completely changed things for me. Henry has a unique system that I think, and I've got an article I'm going to share with you here in just a second, that is certainly a homegrown French system. Now, again, there are definitely roots of it in Bolognese, but he has a distinct take on it that is his own. There is a wonderful article by Tim Rivera called An Essay Containing a Detailed Comparative Analysis of the Treatises of Henry de Saint Didier. And Tim deals a lot with the German manuals and translating them, and the Spanish manuals. And one of the things that he has stated is that although he thinks Didier does bear some resemblance to the Italian systems, but he thinks there's a much stronger connection to the German. To the Spanish. I keep saying German. I apologize. Henry de Saint Didier was from Provençal, and so southern France. So very strong connections down there with the Spanish. Also, he served in the wars against Spain as well as Italy. So there's certainly going to be influence from both there. But Tim states that he thinks there's enough differences with Henry de Saint Didier as far as his guards and the use of his defenses and timing that he is safe. He is comfortable saying that this is a unique system from France, although it is definitely bears strong ties to previous works from he thinks Spain and Italy. One of the things that was very new and very good about DDA's work was how he was diagramming the footwork out. He's using triangles and squares on the ground with the footstep patterns to show you how you're standing and how you're going to move. Unfortunately, one of the problems with this is the patterns on the floor do not stay consistent through the steps. He shifts them as you're stepping so that you don't always necessarily follow exactly how you're moving from one spot to another. DDA has a lot of retreating and thrusting and relies on the refuse stance a lot. And one of the things that we're going to see that shows up repeatedly in almost all of the French works is the attack to the arm when they're trying to attack your leg. And you're stepping back away out of the opponent's reach and attacking the sword arm as they go for your leg. And that shows up in Pelican, it shows up in Des Borders and as well as in Dancy. The other manuals don't spend a lot of time on it. DDA spends a lot of time on it. It's one of his fancy tricks. He talks about it 3 different places in the manual. So it's a wonderful little system. One of the projects that I want to work on down the line is breaking down I've done a couple of classes and ANS competitions where I did reconstructions of DDA's exercises. I want to go back and start breaking those down for video and walking through them step by step. That's not going to happen right away, but that is the next project where this class is kind of heading. So I'm going to stop and see if there's any commentary about DDA, or if people have any questions about him or what he was teaching, and then before we go on.
Did Tim mention anything as to what makes him think of it as being a Spanish style? The refused feet always makes it feel more Bolognese to me, but
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know his the common stuff that Tim does as much.
So he is looking at some of the earlier works, not the Destreza, but the earlier works of the Spanish. The arguments that he made specifically was going into depth in the unsheathings. DDA spends a lot of time showing you how to unsheath the sword and set yourself up in your guard. And he says that the guards are almost identical to some of the Iberian swordplay that he's looked at. And I don't have the name of the book handy in front of me, but he's got a.
It'd
well,
probably
I
be
didn't put it in here.
it'd probably be Godinho. Godinho is really the only pre-Destreza one we've got.
Yes, which is right at the end of the 1600s. I mean, into the 1500s, early 1600s, and he talks a lot about the similarities that's in that work. And that's his and the translation of Godinho that I have is Tim's. So it's I have not gotten through it all the way. I can't tell you whether I agree with him or not, but it certainly makes sense with him being in southern France and involved in the Spanish Wars that there may be some influence from there as well.
Okay, thanks.
But yes, I happen to agree with you. I think Marotzo was created a large foundation of the knowledge he had that he built off of. And even the arm attack can be found in the Bolognese system. It's just used once. It's minor. It's not something that they tout on, where that is a major trick that DDA uses, to the point of part of the reason he uses the refuse stance is to make people go for that leg. So any other comments about DDA or questions? Okay. So now we're going to get to probably one of the most influential people in French fencing. Hieronymus Cavacabo is only called Hieronymus in France. The Italians refer to him as Girlano, not one that I'm good at for French. But the French translation that was done on his work translated his name into Hieronymus. He is an Italian from Bologna. He is believed to have learned fencing in the Bolognese tradition, but he also spent time in Rome with a gentleman referred to as the Paternostro of Rome, and he was one of the premier fencers. Unfortunately, very little is known about who the Paternostro was, but we do have an essay of his work, which was included in Cavacabo's work. We know his original manuscript was in Italian. We know his book was printed in Italian at one point. The translation into French was in 1597. And he was the fencing master to Henry IV before he became king and during king, and his son became the fencing master to Henry's children and held that position to the 1640s. So what we have is a really strong influence in the royal court for at least 50 years of Italian fencing masters teaching in France. His work is definitely Italian. It has got strong influence from both the Bolognese, and you can see the Roman system from dealing with Agrippa in there as well. It's a nice blending of the two. He's using rapiers, although there is some cutting involved, and when he starts talking about beating with the blade and the cuts, they are straight out of the Bolognese system. It's a nice little book, and one that I've been started working through. And the reason is because the French fencing masters in the 17th century, who kind of codified French rapier and started developing an actual system with unified terms and movements, are all going to credit Hieronymus with the foundation, starting with Dancy and going on. So he has a huge influence in the future of particularly French rapier and French combat. He has a huge influence on the French culture for rapier. So I wanted to include him and spend a little bit of time on him. Does anybody have any comments or questions about Cavacabo? Okay. So probably one of the most interesting of the manuals that we're going to deal with is from Captain Pelican. So a gentleman by the name of De La Haye says that a Captain Pelican gave him this information in this manuscript, and then he wrote it down. And it was presented to Maurice of Nassau, which was the brother of the Prince of Orange. It's the only known copy of the manuscript. We do not know how well it was circulated. We do not know that it was even circulated in France. De La Haye claims that Pelican was a member of the French masters. He also claims that he was, taught fencing to one of the French princes, none of which can we collaborate. In fact, both of the articles that I've read that talk about Pelican's history, what we know of him is from De La Haye, and that's it. So one of the articles that I read argues that we have to assume De La Haye wrote the manual, not Pelican. But the French tradition is that the French are very much enamored of Pelican lately, if not have no idea about prior. So I'm leaving Pelican on as the writer of this manual and giving him credit. What is unique about this work is not the swordplay. The swordplay is pretty much Bolognese. There's a little bit of difference. He does talk about grasping the blade and taking it out of the hand, something that DDA spends a lot of time on as well. He does talk about the arm attack as one of the secret tricks. But most of the work in most of his defenses in swordplay is right out of the Bolognese system. But what's unique is his system of showing the movement in the charts that you have in front of you. The disembodied head shows where your opponent is. The graph is dealing with not distance from the opponent, but your opponent's height. So it gives you an idea of how high to hold the sword and where the point should be at. The second weapon is the dagger, and the foot pattern shows you where you're at on the center line as opposed to your opponent and the footwork that you should be using. The numbers correspond with the footwork, and the sword movements show you the order in which things take place and what happens together and what happens in order. It's a neat little system. It is a nice little manual. How much of an influence it had on France when it was published, I can't begin to tell you. As far as we know, there was one manuscript, and it was in the Low Countries. So, but I happen to like it. So we want and it definitely is one of the French masters that we want to include. Does anybody have any questions or comments about Pelican's work? And there is and I haven't been mentioning it, and I'll back up just a moment. Pelican's work, there is a free translation of it in English that has a link from Wichtenauer. Also Cavacabo. There is a translation of his work from the German into English that is on Wichtenauer. Also, there is a transcription of the Italian, the German, and the French manuals for Cavacabo on there as well. So you can go, if you can read French, which I hope to be able to do at some point, you can go through and you can take a look at the French work as well. But it is in English and it is available for free. Also, I've got a couple of different books on DDA, but there is now an English translation of DDA available on Wichtenauer as well. So I was all excited about that. So if you've not been and surfed through Wichtenauer, go and spend a few days there. It's well worth the time. Okay.
I think
Yes.
Cavacabo is translated from the French. I think you can get that on Lulu as well. I think Rob Runnekers has that on there.
Yes, and that's the one I bought was from Lulu.
Okay.
And it's really good. But I think the note on Wichtenauer was saying that the English translation that they have posted there was done from the German version of Cavacabo's, the German translation of Cavacabo's work. So I don't know how many layers that goes through at that point. So okay. And I am butchering Andre's name, but it's Andre Desbordes. His work is the excellence of arms and the discourse on the theory and practice on the excellence of arms. It was written in 1610. It is definitely getting into the rapier, and he is dealing with sword and dagger. There is an argument that at least one of the sources that I was looking at is making, and by the way, all of these are in the bibliography, all these articles I keep just referencing kind of in passing is in the bibliography, and I'll give you my email address at the end of this and I'll put it in the chat so that if anybody wants to contact me, I can email them a copy of the of the class notes. I was going to put it up on Facebook, but could not figure out how to do it. Facebook has seemed to have gotten pretty picky about posting Word documents right now. So we'll have access to all those articles and where they came from in the class notes. So there's an argument that this is really just a French translation of a work by Camillo Palladini. And I've not read Palladini's work, so I can't really answer whether I think that's true or not. We know that one of the arguments is that Palladini's book is in Debord's library. We also know that he has a copy of Cavacabo's work in his library. So whether this is just him taking credit for an Italian manual and doing the French translation, whether there's some original work involved with the translation or whether it's all his, I can't tell you, but there is enough of an argument being made that this is a copy that I wanted to bring that up. Has anybody looked at Palladini's work?
It only just came out,
Okay.
and you have to get it from England. So I don't know that many have looked at it. It's been one of the hidden treasures for ages. And I think the translation came out just before the pandemic.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'm definitely going to put that on my reading list. And I'm also having trouble finding a copy of Debord's work. There's nothing available free online. It looks like there's there's at least one book out on him that I want to try and track down and take a look at, but I haven't had a chance to look at his work yet either. Okay, so the next person we're going to talk about is Dancy. And this is where we start getting a really good, what we're going to think of as French rapier going on. Started with Dancy, who credits his teachings and his learning of rapier not to one of the two French masters that we already have, Didier and Pelican, but the Cavacabo. And so at this point, we start getting a foundation for what we're going to see late in the 1600s with Touché. We're already starting to see a codified system as far as language. We're starting to build a foundation for a codified set of techniques and really starting what's going to become French rapier. Dancy has several works. There's a manuscript, and his work is available from the Renaissance Sword Club's website. And that website is in the resources at the end of my class notes. They've got a really good free translation of the manuscript that was printed early, 1617. And then the printed book, which they have a version for that is available, and I believe you can get that on Amazon, of the full printed work, was printed in 1627. And it's much more in depth. He does not deal so far with the French masters that we've looked at. One, Didier just deals with single sword. Pelican just deals with sword and dagger. Dancy is dealing with both and also throws cape and buckler, I think, in there. Definitely cape. I have looked at Dancy's manuscript. I do not have the book for Dancy yet. That is also on my reading list. But Dancy is very influential here because this is where we start. The argument can be made that this is the start of an actual French system for sword fighting, and it would be a French system for rapier specifically. But it is the beginning. And then I also have a copy of the first page from the book. So our next one that we're going to look at, and there's enough people crediting this manuscript to Don Pedro de Herrera that I went ahead and gave him credit for it in this class notes. The book is actually a manuscript. There are 3 copies of the manuscript that has survived, and it is the Book of Lessons. And this is a rapier manual from a Spaniard. And one of the things they talk about is that he also deals very in here about dealing with people who are fighting with their arms straight out in front of them. So we're already looking at the distressa system and how to counter it and what to deal with it. This manuscript was in French. It was entitled to it was a gift to one of the French kings, and it was he is still using some, although it's in French, he is still using some Spanish terminology, particularly for the guards and for some of the attacks. It shows up in France somewhere between 1600 and 1648. And as far as whether this was translated into French by who translated into French, we have no idea. So we don't know if it was from Don Pedro or if it was somebody else who translated it and then was passing the manuscript around. But we do know that it shows up in France. We do know there are several copies of the manuscript that survived. There is a book on the Book of Lessons that is out that, again, I have not looked at, so I don't know too much about it. But it is definitely gives us, besides the relationship that they're arguing that DDA has with Spain, this gives us another very clear link to the Spanish system and Iberian swordplay being used in France, or at least being circulated through France. Okay, before I hit my last 2, is there any questions or comments? Okay, then we're going to go to one that probably almost everybody's familiar with. So Gigante was translated into French and was available in France in 1619. So the original was in 1610. The translation shows up in 1619. So we have yet another Italian whose teachings would be in France in French and be accessible to people looking for that type of thing. And then our last one is one of my favorite books. I played with this for a very short period of time when a partial English translation came out years ago. Haven't looked at the new translation that is out. It is convoluted. It's a convoluted mess. And for it, I will apologize to those of you who like Destreza, who are on the class. On this call, I really have nothing against Destreza, but it twists my feet up in knots and don't understand it to save my life. However, Gerald Tybalt had his own version of it that was translated into French, although he was Dutch. So why specifically he put it in French, I don't know, but there it is. It was widely available. There's a lot of people who look at it for Destreza. I do understand from some of my friends that practice the Destreza that his version is kind of different and a little odd compared to the Spanish version of it. And there are people on this call who could probably speak more to that if they wished. But he is the last of the fencing masters that I am going to talk about. His work was published in French in 1628. There are a couple other masters French masters that supposedly wrote books that we cannot document, but they all list that they were kind of in the same line as Dancy's work. So I've kind of lumped them in with Dancy. The next fencing master who's going to make a difference is going to be post 1650. So that's a whole nother class or discussion. So this is the written work. Does anybody have any questions or commentary about the written resources before we head into the last? And we're much later than I thought we were, so I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. So we've talked about what's available. We talked about what is out there. The foreign masters in the French culture, let me get out of this. The foreign masters in the French culture were extremely influential. We definitely have a strong Italian system, particularly with the Bolognese that shows up with Marotzo, and then again with Cavacabo. We have a lot of influence from other Italian masters, with Cavacabo's influence from the Paternostro in Rome and Gigante. We are seeing clear examples of German swordplay being taught in France. We are seeing clear examples of Spanish being taught in France. So the question of what did French fencing look like is probably whatever you wanted to do. We can justify most of the major schools of fencing on the continent in France during this time period through either the manuals or through people who are teaching. We definitely have a homegrown French system. The problem is it wasn't a unified system. It varied greatly from master to master until the 17th century. Starting with Dancy, we start seeing a system that gets much more codified and unified into what we can say is French fencing. But Didier and Pelican use different guards, different footwork, different terminology for the same moves. There is no consistency whatsoever. Although there are some similarities in techniques that they are both teaching, you can't really consider one an extension of the other. So as far as was there a French system in the SCA time period, the answer is no. There are some French masters that we can play with. Is there a French system that we can look at if you're willing to go a little farther beyond the 1600 date? Absolutely. And rapier is where you're going to see that. Up through, I do want to point out that up through most of the manuals that we have, particularly the French manuals, DDA and Pelican, although there's a lot of thrusting going on, they're still relying heavily on cuts. It really is a cut and thrust system. It is not what we think of as classic rapier. Although you can already starting to see the predominance of the thrusting and those techniques are there, but that's not all that's there. Definitely heavy on the cut and thrust. Okay, so we've got a couple more minutes. I think if you all will indulge me, I'm done with a portion of the class. Does anybody have any questions, any comments? And while we're talking, I'm going to go to the chat and put my email address in so that if people want a copy of the class notes, I can send them to them as soon as I can figure out how to get to chat. There it is.
So I have a question. What's the website you were using? Lichtenauer?
It's Wichtenauer. So, and again, it'll be in the handout, but it is
Okay.
Wichtenauer.
But it'll be in the handout?
It's also in the handout, yes.
Awesome.
Phenomenal site. I wish this had been around 20 years ago. Lots and lots of work have been done on it. I cannot thank the people who put that up and work on it enough. I'll give you my little plug. They're asking for some assistance to cover some costs in expanding what they're doing and continuing what they're doing. And if you use the site, dropping them a couple of bucks might be helpful. I have done so. It is a wonderful site. A lot of the English translations on there that they have are free and accessible to anybody who wants to look at them. A lot of access to some of the manuscripts and the libraries and museums where the manuscripts are being held. Phenomenal, phenomenal resource.
Nice. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Philippe, I had a question.
Yes, sir.
So just from the kind of survey of the teachers that you've talked about here, it looks like they've borrowed heavily from other places, Italy and Spain. Do you think that they don't have a stronger homegrown, a growth of masters and schools because their main army thrust lasted so much longer and so much more effectively in their chivalric tradition than other places?
I do. I think it also had to deal with Francis I. He had this obsession with all things Italian. He was obsessed with the conquest of Milan. He brought in Benvenuto Cellini, who was a goldsmith, and brought him into his court so that he had an artist. He brought in Leonardo da Vinci. He married his son off to an Italian noblewoman, Catherine de Medici. And then Catherine Medici's sons are all using French fencing masters. I'm sorry, Italian fencing masters. So I do think that the reason that they fell behind was they held on to the chivalric tradition much longer than everybody else. But then we also had a predisposition for the Italians, and we see all the royal patronage going to the Italian masters, not to the homegrown French masters. And it's not until the Masters of Paris was created that we really see involvement of the royals into the homegrown French masters at all. So yeah, I think you are correct. I think it's partly because of them holding on to the chivalric tradition so long, but also to just romanticizing the Italians.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? So one of my intents from doing the class is to try and help boost interest in some of the French fencing masters, particularly DDA and Pelican and Cavacabo, all within our time period and doing some really good work. And also giving more people to talk to about the French masters and to play with using the French masters. So if people are interested or know people who are interested in that, I'm going to be trying to network a little bit across the SCA to get more people who are interested in playing with some of these masters and looking at them in depth. So
I had a question for you.
yes, sir.
Have you come across any similarities from the movements of, especially I guess Saint-Didier, since that's who you've been looking at the most, and any of the French dance manuals of the time?
Oh,
I've been
absolutely.
noticing stuff between Destreza and Spanish dance, so I'm kind of curious how much crossover there is on the French side.
Absolutely. So and I'm going to magically disappear for 2 seconds. So there is a wonderful book called Orchesography by Arbeau, and it is late 1500s. It is the French dance manual we have. It's where the pavans, allemans come from. He is using the exact same terminology as Didier is using for the footwork. Didier was a little bit prior to him. Both Didier and Arbeau says that every gentleman in France needs to know how to fence, dance, and play tennis. So there definitely is a strong connection with the French dancing, particularly the galliards and the foot movement that Didier is using with with defining the foot terminology, the foot positions for the different movements and the steps. You don't see anything that actually mimics the fighting so much in Arbo, but the terminology and the foot positions he is using are identical. And Nicola, you were saying that you saw a strong correlation between the dancing and the destreza.
Yeah, I do. I've been trying to start working with Esquivel, who's a 1642 Spanish dance manual, who explicitly is using destreza footwork in some of his stuff.
Oh, excellent.
I wrote a pavon that's done as a destreza footwork drill. So I'm trying to get more dance there into them. On the Italian side, I'll use an Italian court reverence to teach people as my initial way of teaching people an Italian fencing stance. And I found the Spanish reverence ties to the Spanish gaining step in destreza. So I'm assuming there's maybe some similarities even on the reverence and some action within the French system as something that's totally internal to any young nobleman by the time he picks up a sword from his previous dance training.
Absolutely. And I think I think there is definitely a strong link between them. DDA goes so far as to say that tennis and dancing are first cousins to swordplay. So
yeah,
go
I
ahead.
think French you may have been the one who told me this, that French tennis still uses the same terminology as French cuts.
Yes. Yes, the terminology for the tennis strokes that are in the back of, so DDA has a section on tennis in the back of his book, which is the other thing that I really like. And at some point, if we are at Gulf Wars, where there is a medieval tavern with a nice sloped roof, we can play tennis. But the footwork and the strokes, they're using the same terminology. He uses the same terminology he uses in his fencing manual. Are there any other questions or commentary?
Just a quick thank you. This has been very informative.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And if anybody has comments on the technology or the presentation or the handout, do contact me privately. I am looking for some feedback on that because, like I said, this is the first time I've taught this class, and the section on the manuals went much longer than I thought they were originally going to do. So we got a lot less time talking about what all that means. So I do apologize for that. And I included my email on the chat. So feel free to email me. And if you'd like a copy of the class handout, I will send that to people right away. Okay. Thank you guys very much. I'd like to thank Rum for hosting this and for providing the technical support, and also for live streaming this and recording it. It should be available on the Rum YouTube page. And thank you all very much.